One of the counterintuitive experiences I have and have had, which I'm still learning about, so maybe you haven't yet, is the phenomena of defending against pain with catastrophe. So it goes like this. We're 1 year old, and there's a mom and dad, a giant, and they're both inflicting pain at different times. It's terrifying, it's traumatic, because they could kill us. They could. Why wouldn't they? What if they do, right? It's an overwhelming and horrific state of affairs, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? But rather than being crippled by the weight of the trauma, we create a defense, right? A new iteration of ego, a new iteration of identity creates a defense. And the defense is something necessary to distract ourselves from the overwhelming trauma, the helplessness in particular. So one way to look at this is that the worst state that a human being can experience is trauma, which means that it's something that could kill us. Alone, which means that no one's there and protecting us, in a helpless state. So this is the trifecta of misery. Trauma, I could die, this and that, I'm alone, I can't depend on anyone, I'm completely helpless, I have no idea, I'm of course overwhelmed, it's traumatic. Now, any one of these things, right, together they create the epitome of misery. Now, if we move from helpless to powerful, trauma, alone, powerful, that's a good movement, right? And if we're a little bit less alone, if some part of us is responding there, right, a caregiver. So there's trauma, there's a caregiver, and there's power. Now, a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old in a shame-based state in a dysfunctional house is not a good caregiver, right? And their power is not to become a competent adult and resolve all the issues, no. The power of a 3-year-old in a traumatized state is to flail around and create something worse. The power of someone in a helpless state is to exacerbate the pain or distract from it. You might, for example, take up some kind of an addiction to flailing around, screaming. But what we're doing is we're arresting control from the perpetrator by inducing our own dynamic. Right? My wife, when she was young in a severely dysfunctional family, took to pulling out sections of her own hair as a sign of protest and as a message of power. Right? You think you can hurt me? Watch this. I can pull out sections of my own hair. Right? It's a message of power and agency. And while you're doing that, you are not waiting to be hit. You are not waiting to be violated. You're not waiting to be raped. It's fucking painful to pull out a section of your own hair, and so that's where the attention goes. You've arrested the attention and pulled it away You've wrested the attention away from the traumatic area of helplessness and located the attention in an area of power. The helplessness diminishes, the power increases. One of the trifectas of absolute suffering is reduced. Now, who's doing that? Now, there is no competent adult in the house. Otherwise, kids don't have to pull out their own hair to manage their suffering, right? There are no adults in the house. A 7-year-old kid, traumatized and abused, is not an adult. A fucked up mother who induces that level of traumatic shame is not an adult, right? She's a child in a grown body reenacting abuse. The father who stands passively by, looking away, leaving the room rather than confronting the abusive mother, is not an adult. He's a coward. It's a little boy who doesn't want to be punished by an angry mom. So he leaves the room, lets his daughter take the brunt of the pain, right? You deal with that ogre. I don't want to, right? She scares me. You're only 7-year-old. You deal with it, right? A fucking coward. So what's left is a 7-year-old coming up with this. I'll take care of you. You're in miserable pain. You can't deal with it. I'll pull some of your hair out. That'll distract you. It'll give you a sense of agency. This is for you, right? But it's not adult love. It's desperate, addictive coping mechanisms, which is all that an abused child can come up with. But it is nonetheless a caregiver. It's medicine for the aloneness. You're not alone. I'm here pulling your hair out, right? So the powerlessness is replaced with power. The loneliness is replaced by a self-induced abuse. And the trauma remains, but two of the variables go down. Now, often in a dysfunctional culture, in a dysfunctional family, the child is punished or is no longer punished, right? Many times if a child will hurt themselves, the abuser will stop hurting them, right? And so then the trauma goes down, right? So there is a cessation, a pause, right? So the caregiver is hurting themselves with their own power rather than waiting for it to happen. And there's a cessation in the trauma, right? Now, you can see this in a dynamic where a child went out late, past the curfew, comes in, and their parents beat the shit out of them. And then the child runs away from home, right? So it's a self-induced, they could die. It's a self-induced trauma. There's a caregiver, I'm not going to leave you alone with these assholes. And then the parents say, oh, if you'll just come home, I won't punish you, right? There's that dynamic there. So if you induce and escalate the trauma, there'll be a cessation. Now, the trouble is, in a dysfunctional family without any adults, right, where you just have children and adolescents and grown bodies narcissistically doing whatever is expedient for them, you have a lot of trauma. You have a lot of attachment trauma. You have a lot of abuse. You have a lot of distrust. And so a lot of these different managers and protectors come in that just know how to hurt, but they know how to distract from the helpless hurt and escalate the hurt in a way that causes a cessation in the abuse and has agency, right? So now we grow up in this thing, and there have been, any number of different waves or layers of that over the years, right? And the giants disappear, and we become our own giant. But now those original feelings, those original traumas that never got dealt with start to come up. Now this happens when our life is together, not when it's in crisis, right? If you have severe PTSD and you re-enlist and go back into heavy fire, you will not feel symptomatic. You know, your vigilante, your hypervigilance is appropriate as long as you're in a war environment. So when people can't heal PTSD and are coming home in a dysfunctional culture that doesn't know how to reintroduce the humanity into the warrior, then, right, they feel crazy, right? I'm just as upset about a firecracker as I was going over an IED or, you know, some kind of sniper attack. The hypervigilance is there, the reality has changed. Well, if you go back into a traumatic environment, then you don't feel crazy. So that's one way to do it, right? So we create a new crisis, a new problem, and then our same state feels appropriate. We don't feel so crazy. But the other thing is we may persist in creating a more peaceful, a more beautiful world in some way. And then what happens is all those griefs, all those loneliness, all those buried feelings that never had a safe place start to come up. And we're in a traumatically illiterate cult and we don't know what to do with them. Overwhelm, helplessness, anxiety, dissociation comes up as a feeling, as a body memory. And these managers, these inner 7-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 3-year-olds start to take over. Like, come on, we got to do something. We got to pull out the hair. We got to do this, got to do that. But some part of us is saying, what are we doing? What are we doing? And they don't have an answer for that, right? That kept us alive in some way. And we're traumatically illiterate. And even if we know it in our head, we don't know what to do in practice. We don't have the body memory of what it feels like to be an adult caring for ourselves in this situation. So we go into an addictive distraction. We try a variety of things that kept us alive as a child, but they're self-inflicted pain to avoid the helplessness of a lack of agency, but many of us don't have a clue what's going on. So I'm finding a lot of that at the moment. Tiredness, tightness of muscles, all kinds of defenses that make sure that I'm not present for my feelings. And they're coming up not at horrible times of crisis, but precisely because there's a calm. And so those bubbles, those memories start to come up through the body, through the awareness, and challenge me to respond in a way that I never have before. Challenge me to respond in a way that I haven't experienced being modeled before. Challenge me to make sense of these things that don't fit within the cult paradigm. You're supposed to feel good when your life is better, not feel worse. Right? So there's a disconnect when you have a psychologically and traumatically illiterate cult. The members of the cult are psychologically and traumatically illiterate, and so they're going to follow the cult narrative. You should be feeling good because your life is so good. You shouldn't be feeling worse because your life is so good, right? But there's just a complete incomprehension of the narrative. So I wonder, for you, do you find sometimes perhaps the biggest crisis of all being the stillness, the peace that comes on the other side of success, and the panic of what to do with the feelings that start rising into that empty space. I think it's one reason people have a hard time meditating is because the paradigm of their meditation does not account for the fact of repressed trauma being a key part of it.